Welcome to Gagliardi's Got Real Estate Podcast, hosted by myself, Gerald, Sabri, and Rocky Gagliardi. We look forward to bringing you something fresh, something new the Goulburn Valley hasn't seen before, more informative information. We've got special guests, hot topics. Make sure you follow on your preferred podcast platform, GSRE socials. We hope you enjoy this episode.
G'day guys, it's Rocky here from Gagliardi Scott Real Estate. Today we are fortunate enough to have two wonderful guests in David McKenzie and Chris Crouch from Opteon Valuations, and we're going to talk everything about valuations, or as much as we can, to cover a lot of topics, and we might zone in on a few main topics for the day. So before we get started in our chat, I'd like to introduce Dave McKenzie, and if you can let us know a bit about yourself and your business, David, and introduce your history, experience.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Rocky. So, David McKenzie, as you said, Opteon Property Group, Opteon Valuers. Our business has been going for 50 years in the Goulburn Valley, started over in Coburn. I've been valuing in the area for 33, 34 years now. And our total staff, we've got about sort of 60, 65 people across northern Victoria in a few different offices, Albury, Wangaratta, Benalla, Shepparton, for argument's sake. And we provide valuation advice to banks, to investors, to government departments, to all sorts of institutions and organisations that need to report on their property assets as well. Compulsory acquisition work, litigation work, the full gamut of sort of property advice across all property classes, basically.
Quality. Chris Crouch.
Yeah.
How long you been in it for, mate?
I've been in since 06, so how long is that? About 17 years.
Yes.
But based here, or in Shepparton for just over 10 years. So,
beautiful. So where were you before that? Where did you?
Originally from Mount Gambier in South Australia.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're a South Australian boy?
I am.
Does that explain why you're so harsh on a cricket field in the middle of the pitch, Chris, when you're sledge in the middle? Or?
Yeah, there's something about the SA Vic rivalry there.
I've worked it out after all these years. I understood why you're so harsh on me.
He's not a Crows man.
Who do you follow?
North Melbourne supporter.
Geez, that's even worse. I've got a few North Melbourne supporters.
Well.
So you did valuing in South Australia. Much of a difference between South Australia? I didn't know that. So is it much difference in South Australia compared to Victoria?
Oh, not a hell of a lot. Similar sort of title systems and stuff like that. There's a few little sort of minor differences, I suppose. A few adjustments I made when I came over here. But I hadn't been in the game for very long at that stage, so it probably didn't take too much to sort of change and pick up this how we do it here, I suppose. So, yeah.
So
just on that, Crouchy manages all our residential valuations. So he manages the team that does all the residential work basically across all our area of northern Victoria, southern New South Wales, where we work.
I was going to ask you what you specialise. So residential is your main forte, which is forte good. So how do you find that with what's happening in the last 2 or 3 years with the residential landscape?
It's been extremely challenging, especially when it started COVID. We had no idea what was going to happen. All the feedback was that the market would drop 10 to 20%. Essentially, it turned out to be totally the opposite to that. So it was pretty challenging to sort of pick up where the market was at, and not you've sort of generally do your valuations based totally on facts and previous sales, but the market was moving so quickly, you had to readjust sort of how you approached it. So
I think we found the same thing. We were almost 2 months behind every time we put a evaluation of a property. Like in the end, we had to sort of change our tact and go, we had to be 2 months in advance about where we were at. Because at the time, the property gets on the market, we almost lost it. It was going so quick, wasn't it?
Yeah. One of the challenges we have, and one of the tensions often between valuers and banks and clients and agents, indeed, when you've landed a sale and it's a record price, the market's strong, and we have to rely on settled sales, because when a valuer signs off on a valuation, there's all sorts of legal obligations that go with that. People rely on it, banks rely on it, all sorts of things, and it's a legal document. Different to an agent's opinion.
Correct.
So we've got to rely on things that are settled, and quite often there's a 30, 60, 90 day settlement period. And when the market was racing along like it was over the last couple of years, we would be ringing agents on a regular basis and say, you've sold this place, it's a record price. we reckon it stacks up okay. I can see if this sales falls over, you'll probably get the same price again.
Yes.
But guess what? We can't support it. There is nothing we can do to get anywhere near that price, knowing that it's probably okay. And that's the different sort of perspective between a valuation and a valuer's view of the world and what an agent can do.
Yeah.
So
how did you explain that to the bank? So explain to listeners out there, David, it was when, you really got to be factual, which is why it's a legal document. But how do you justify it to a bank when the banks... Did they obviously just get over it in the sense of the... They sort of read the market, obviously.
The banks are funny beasts.
Yeah.
There are people with different roles in the banks.
Yes.
So effectively, the people in the branches are usually effectively salesmen. They're credit salespeople. They want to get money out the door. So people always say, the banks are telling you to be conservative. You're the bank value. We know how this rolls. But in fact, the bank manager normally wants the deal to get over the line.
Yes.
He wants to get the money out the door. It helps their budget.
Yes.
And they're as disappointed as anyone when we actually knock back a sale or say we can't get to that purchase price or we can't support this deal.
Yeah.
But in fact, there are other people in the bank, in the credit risk area, who are very careful about banks' exposure to risky assets, to lending heavily in peak market conditions, all those sorts of things. They're the one with the bigger risk view, and they're the ones that ring us up and say, what are you doing? You're crazy signing off on all these record prices. What's wrong with you? So we're getting different messages from different parts of the banks every week, basically.
You get smashed from agents, you get smashed from banks.
Agents as well.
What do you mean?
Agents don't like it when we can't support a price, but what we have to do is communicate really clearly and effectively and say, look, we've got a job to do. This is why we're doing it. Talk it through. Is there anything we've missed? Is there anything we haven't understood about this? Anything else that can help us maybe get it over the line? Sometimes there is. Sometimes there's just not. And particularly getting a valuer to sign off on a record price is always a challenge. Almost by definition, a valuer can't support a record price.
Yeah. So the last few years, Crouchy,
Yes.
a lot of record prices?
A lot of record prices, yes. Absolute challenge.
Yeah.
So, like David said, especially early days, by the time a property settles, the market's well and truly moved on, had moved on in that period of time. So you had to, we had a lot of conversations with agents like yourselves just to work out what's around, like David had mentioned. Anything you've got in the pipeline that's only you've just recently sold in that week. So basically a week was enough to tell us where the market was at. So you'd have to always put in your 3 settled sales. That's a requirement. And then add in some of those agents' advice sales is what we'd call it, and analyse those to get as close to the purchase price as we could if we didn't support it. But add in a few clauses into our reports as well to try and to back up and explain this is where the market's at, even though the settled sales might not support the value. We've got these most recent sales that probably do, so to get it over the line that way.
So how does that document explain the difference of the valuation and then also valuation document if that just needs to be stood up in court? So if you had to go to court, is every document you do legally binding regardless? So there's no specific...
It absolutely is. Look, it depends. We do work for different clients.
Yeah, correct.
And each of them has a different set of legal obligations. The reason that they're asking us for an opinion of value is because they want to rely on it. They want to lend money based on that. They want to sue someone based on that. They want to buy a property based on that. They want to compulsorily acquire a bit of that property to build a highway based on that. Yeah. All these things are contested, and ultimately, if you're found to have made a mistake, if something goes wrong and you've done a valuation on a property, the bank lends money on it, the person can't pay the mortgage, the bank sells the property, and we valued it for $1 million. They sell it 6 months later for $650,000. Yeah. Guess who they're coming to see for the difference and say, we would not have done that deal if you hadn't have told us the place was worth $1 million. We're suing you for the $350,000 difference. And you then have to go through this process of defending your valuation. It can end up in the county court or the Supreme Court or the federal court, depending on where it is and what you've done and how much money is involved. And it's a horrible process.
You can imagine.
So, look, luckily, in our business is 50 years old, we've had, count on one hand, the number of negligence lawsuits we've had to defend. But it's a fact of life that we do thousands of valuations a year, and not everyone is perfect, unfortunately.
No,
we do the best we can.
Yeah.
So every one of those has got a lot riding on it for us.
Yeah. Interesting that, because that's one take, and that's good to explain to the listeners, because you've got a lot to hang on as well. I mean, you get pressures not just from an agent, but also pressure from vendors and buyers and so forth. So you've got to protect yourself. But I'm guessing also that your valuation's used as well in court, not for your purpose to protect yourself, but for other court battles and so forth as well. Is that right? Yeah.
Very much. Look, we do work for matrimonial, family law stuff when people are looking for the value of the assets to divide an asset pool in a marriage separation or something like that. There is property litigation all the time for all sorts of things you think about. And the other thing is rental determinations as well, where a tenant and a landlord are in serious dispute. The valuer will come in basically as an umpire in that situation, and normally you're saying yes or no, so you're going to please someone and not please the other one in that situation. That is an area where there's a lot of litigation around people claiming that valuers' opinions have been negligent. Because sometimes on big city buildings you might be talking about rents of a couple of, multi-millions of dollars a year just in rent. So there's a lot swinging on this, and if someone doesn't like the valuer's opinion, guess what? They sue them. So, our documents are used in court for a wide range of purposes by all sorts of parties. That's why we sort of we don't take a conservative approach in trying to write the value down, because in fact valuers can be sued for being too conservative. That doesn't suit. We've got to try and get it as correct as we can, but we've got to justify it as well as we can. That's the thing.
Yeah, definitely. Amazing, isn't it? So when you do it's okay to have your valuation done and so forth, but what about other things that the banks might want to ask for, or whoever's getting a valuation? Like recently we've had floods, right? So, has a flood gone through the property? How much does that impact, or is it damaged? You're not a builder, right? You're not an engineer, but you obviously trained eyes to a certain degree. Do you have to make comments on when you do a valuation of a house and so forth? And
Yeah, absolutely. That's the current or most recent challenge we've had with the floods. So, there's probably some areas around here, but particularly Rochi, which got hit really hard. So there's a lot of stuff that we've got to consider there. Because the majority of the houses there actually did get hit by the floods. So, obviously we're not experts at that, at building sort of stuff, those types of things. So we're relying on expert reports to come up with a value. So, that's a part of what we're required to access, I suppose, to come up with the best result.
You can't always tell as a layman and as a valuer, even though we've been trained, we've done a couple of subjects in building techniques and things like that, so we know more than the man in the street. But we're not builders and we're not architects. So we again, the credit risk people in the banks effectively made up the rules for these flood-affected properties, that we're not doing valuations of something where the floor's been wet unless we've got a builder's report, an insurance assessment, and a mould report to show that, because mould is a big deal in these places as well, but all that's been dealt with. We know exactly what we're looking at. We know whether the building's structurally sound or not. We can then make a fully formed sort of opinion of value. So we actually had to come up with some tiering in our office. Did the land get wet but the house was okay? Well, that we can go ahead and do a valuation. There's a market for that. Did the subfloor get wet? Did the stumps and the subfloor get wet? Did water get inside the house? And if water got inside the house, the rule was basically we can't do a valuation of that until you can provide us with these other expert reports that we can take into account in our advice.
That's good, isn't it? So if you go for it, say I've just sold a house, bank needs a valuation, you ring me up, you go through, you see a pergola that might not be right, or you see a big crack in a wall or something like that. Does that sort of come into play? Do you make the banks aware of that as well? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, as far as the pergola goes, again, we're a little bit limited to, we're not experts in that stuff. However, your experience does sort of expose you to certain, I guess, levels of quality, like something that you think, that should be there, that's well built, as opposed to something that's not. It's, I guess in that way, it's a little bit of an experience or opinion based as to whether you think that might be legal or not. So, but absolutely, it's something we report. And make an assumption either way, and advise the bank of that, and then they can make their own inquiries. And cracking in the walls, another thing that we've got to observe again, on our own experiences as to how serious that might be, but really make the bank alert. Yep, there's some cracking in the walls. That could be a bit of movement. It might just be a bit of superficial damage.
Yep.
And make our assumptions based on that. Recommend that they cite a building inspection report or similar. And then we open it to review if they
want to look at it.
Provide that.
It's important for the
we do that a fair bit.
Yeah.
When a valuer sees a significant, what they think is a significant fault or a defect on whatever sort of property it is, just to keep the wheels moving, we'll often say, look, the value was $800,000, but we noticed these problems. There might be termites. We think we saw some live termite damage there. We saw some cracking and we're worried it might be structural. We'll say the value is $800,000, subject to the bank citing a builder's report saying that that's not structural, or subject to a satisfactory pest inspection, or subject to some other specialist advice. So we're sort of putting a red flag up there for the bank and saying the value's okay, subject to actually you satisfying yourself on a couple of these things. So we're
it's valued at
sort of
800.
eyes and ears for the risk section of the bank.
Yeah.
And when we do things like that again, typically the sales people in the bank don't love it, but the credit risk people demand we do it. So
that's right. And even if we know there's pretty clear significant damage here, we've got to make an allowance based on our experience again to say, right, it might cost $20,000 to re-stump this house and fix this damage, and then also this is our assumption. Send it off to the bank and say, if you want to get your own quotes and stuff like that, we can review that if it's significantly different to what we've assumed.
So when you say that, so you say you value your property at $800 and it says $30,000 worth of stumping.
Yep.
Is that including the stumping, or do you just say $830 but deduct, or you just say it says $830 deduct your?
It's that net
it's
result.
as
net
is.
result.
Yeah.
It's important for the listeners to know that because we have. To be honest, a lot of agents won't go in when we do give our advice, and if you're your agent worth your salt, you try to give the best advice possible because a lot of agents are in there trying to win a listing, and they're trying to give them as least negative comments as they possibly can, which I think's the wrong way of doing it. You try to do the right thing at the start. The last people we do think about is the valuers. Only when it's tough and tight in the market, we do explain the fact that a builder might see a pergola that might not be a permit or cracking and that sort of stuff, but we don't often sort of bring up, when it comes time to valuation, that, you're the eyes and the ears for the bank.
Yes.
You're walking through. It's actually them, you're walking through them on their behalf. It's actually them as an extension.
That's right.
A lot of the people don't realise that when they're out there. So they're doing it. The last thing they think about, if it's a first home buyer going in, got a limited amount of deposit, high risk, and the bank's just looking for an excuse, like the credit people looking for an excuse not to prove it. So compared to the salesman to say, I wanted to prove it. So I think that's important for the listeners to know that's as a another layer towards
An
it.
interesting way to think about it is the valuation is the bank's property. So the vendor will say, can we get a copy of the valuation? Or the buyer who's going
We've
for
had
the
that over
loan
the
will
years,
say, can we get a copy of the valuation? And we say, well, the bank's asked us to do it. The bank's paying for it. They can give you a copy if they like, but we can't. This isn't about you and me. This is about us and the bank. And we're giving the bank advice. It's actually got, so, that changes the sort of people thinking, you're not here for me at all. You're here for the bank. You're here to help the bank out, not us.
And a vendor's got to realise that too, because you're there on behalf of the buyer and their protection, not them, themselves as well.
That's right.
That's right.
So it works. There's so many different layers and emotions involved in it, especially in residential property. Touching back on your commercial side of things, that's a bit different. It's more of a business sort of a aspect. Allude a bit more onto that, Dave, before when you were mentioning how the role of a valuer plays. I get this all the time when 9 times out of 10, especially around here, they rely on what the agent sort of says, what the renewal's coming up. We think it's worth this rate per square metre, this and that. But there is times when, you've got a bit of a fight going on, that the tenant doesn't really want to move the location, but not really going to go to what the landlord's expectations are going to be. 9 times out of 10, there's a clause in the contract that says revert to a valuer. So that gets paid. So explain to the listeners that if you're a tenant out there or a landlord, vice versa, and you are having a stalemate, I suppose, David, you can explain that role as far as to engage your office to go and do it for them.
Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. Nearly every lease, every properly drawn lease has got this dispute resolution mechanism in it, and it's called a determination. And the parties, the lessor and the lessee, the tenant and the landlord, can agree to appoint a valuer who can go and do an assessment of the market rent. But sometimes they can't even agree on what value to appoint. And say, I don't want to get him, I don't want to get him. We've got prior dealings with them. So in fact, the circuit breaker for that is the leases will say the president of the Property Institute or the president of the REIV or the Small Business Commissioner will appoint a valuer. So to be appointed as a valuer for a determination under those circumstances, you've got to have done specific training, you've got to have so many years experience, and you've got to be already approved for that sort of work by these bodies effectively. So then you get an appointment either from the tenant and the landlord or the Small Business Commissioner or whoever it may be. We then have to read all the lease documentation, all the variations, all the assignments, make sure that because it's the rent under the lease, and leases can have strange terms and conditions in them, as you know. So we might all have a good idea that the rent on this building should be $300 a square metre, but who's paying the outgoings? Were there rent-free periods? Are there incentives in the market? Are there waivers there? Are there all sorts of things that make this deal? So it's not just the premises, it's the premises in the context of the lease, because the tenant wants to take up a new term, but he doesn't want to pay the rent the landlord's asking, and the landlord doesn't want to discount the rent. So it's all those things, and it's quite a legal process again. There's a very clear steps about what we've got to do. We can't deal with one party or the other one at any point of time. Any correspondence has got to go to everybody at every point of time. People can make submissions. The tenant and the landlord can write us letters.
It's more
and
of
say,
in depth, isn't it?
And here's why I think it's worth $400 a square metre. Here's why I think it's worth $200 a square metre. You read all that stuff. You go and do your own work and your research and your analysis. You write a report and you send it out to both parties on the same day at the same time. And that's usually the end of the process. But quite often, as we said,
someone's going to be unhappy.
Someone's going to be unhappy.
and look, the reason for that, being on the sales end of it, is a tenant's going to be unhappy because they don't want to leave. They're going to uplift everything and spend a lot of fortune to move somewhere to get a cheaper rent. They've got that goodwill from that premises, but if it comes back at the wrong side, they're going to pay all that extra, because it's determined by that. At the same time, the landlord's not going to be happy because not only do they get less rent if it turns detrimental to them, but also affects the net value of their equity of the property because the rent, especially if it's an investment asset. So that's why, if you're out there listening, you've got a commercial property or you're renting one, it's important, really important that you can ask the agent's opinion. 9 times out of 10 we're pretty right. And look, I'll no secret, I'll ring, if I'm doing something, I'll ring valuer's opinion and sort of see so I'm right myself. But like our documents aren't legally binding. Yours are.
We're often checking in with each other. Commercial agents and commercial valuers talk to each other a lot. And we're all very mindful of what we can and can't share, because quite often we're holding quite sensitive and commercial and commercial in confidence information. And I'll ring Rocky, or Rocky will ring me, and I'll say, look, I just can't tell you. I know about this deal, or I know that, but I'm sorry, you're going to have to respect the fact I can't disclose that to you. So it's not an open channel or anything like that. But you're absolutely right. They always work out most of the time through goodwill and just negotiation, and it all happens quite smoothly. But when the wheels fall off and you're in serious dispute, it takes a bit of time, and it's quite an expensive exercise as well. And there's a lot of case law and there's a lot of legislation. Judges have a lot to say on litigation around rental disputes and rental determinations. And there's the Retail Leases Act, which we have to do it in accordance with. So we're looking at the building, we're looking at the lease, we're reading the legislation, and we're keeping up to date with the current court cases on what judges have said about how to interpret all this stuff. And that's the context that we actually do our final advice in.
And that's why it's important, I suppose. I laugh when you say before, when you mentioned that you've done a job for someone and they don't really like you, they don't want to pick you, they'll get someone else. But you've really got no choice but to do what you're doing objectively. You're going to have more risk than anyone else going around. So, Crouchy, explain to me. I get this all the time. I go to a house and value it, and then the landlord, the owner will pull out the CIV, the rates. Explain the difference. My property's worth more than this, but this property's worth this. This is what my rates say it's worth. And I go, yes, that you're right, but look, let's get serious about this. And so explain. And I understand that over the years, I don't know if you still do it, but your office has a lot to do with the council rates and valuations. So explain that process. How council determines obviously the rate valuation, the CO capital improved, and also the land value. and how that's determined and compared to, say, a normal sale process, like when we go and value a property and why they're all different, you know?
Yeah, no, fair enough. I've never done a rating and taxing valuation before, but I basically understand the process. But, so essentially they will use similar data and input sort of different pieces of data into their, like an automated valuation model, and they'll probably drive around, I think, once a year to have a look just from the roadside, and then enter that data into what their systems and work out sort of roughly where it fits in. I guess the SV, the site value, is your estimated land value.
How much time is involved in that? Like, you know, you go past a home and you look at one home. You look at it that closely in the sense there might be some damage or roughness on that? Or you just bang?
I don't think so. No.
That's my point.
They can't get into that level of detail.
Yeah, that's my point. Yeah,
you know, like our office on our private side of things, as we say, we do probably 2,000 or 3,000 valuations a year. They're doing hundreds of thousands of valuations a year. They value every property in every council every year now.
That's my point.
They used to do it every few years. So in fact, it's all
annually
generated.
now. I thought it was every couple of years. There you go.
It's all computer generated, and it's a big data exercise basically.
That's massive. Yeah.
So they've got all the sales, they've got all the land areas, all the building areas, but they don't. And we get paid hundreds or sometimes thousands of dollars to do a valuation.
Yeah.
They get paid tens of dollars to do a valuation for each of these things. $5 or $6 a house sort of thing. So they're doing mass valuation exercises, and they can't pick up the particular nuances, positives or weaknesses of a property.
Yep.
It's a big data smoothing sort of exercise, like Crouchy said, and it's not a bad starting point. And the main thing with council valuations is to make sure that they're consistent. So if everyone sort of, they're trying to make sure the reason that council get valuation done is to apportion the rates that the council need to run that's what it's for. So it's, it's a different exercise altogether.
And that's the battle, because you're not walking inside the house, you're not seeing it. There's nothing, your house can put, you don't know if it's a 50 square home compared to a 20 square home. You're not going to go and look at all the plans in the council and all, any of that. So, just to say, you talk to your client every day, it gives you an idea. But leading on to that, especially in the commercial world, even residential, I suppose, but the valuations, when the council does, do the valuations, and people are challenging them for the rates, because obviously the cost of living and the rates are going up, especially for tenants that are outgoings are going up. They're part of their outgoings and their payment. Normally there's a small window, I think, in the council that you can fight it, is that right, or challenge it?
Yeah, you can object. After you receive a new rates notice, you've got 2 months to lodge an objection.
Yep.
And then a valuer will get in touch with you and have a discussion. If it raises serious issues, they'll quite often come out and have a look at the property at that point.
Yes.
And you say, there's all this stuff you don't know. It flooded, it's it's structurally unsound, it's got termites, goodness knows what it might be. Whatever the case might be, they'll come out and have a look, and then they'll make a decision. Now, if you don't like that, you can then appeal it through a court process.
Yes.
But that initial sort of objection period is that you've got 60 days after you get in your rate notice to have a look at it and see whether you're happy with it.
That's important to know. 60 days after you get your rate notice, because I hear a lot, challenge it, but that 60-day notice is gone. The council don't want to hear about it. So, if you're out there and you're listening, you can challenge your valuations on your CIV, especially with the cost of living and the rates. And I think they've raised it again. They've capped it at 3.5%. I think the council this year again. But you can challenge it because, like you said, you're not going to know what each specific property is. And 9 times out of 10, you will get a phone call from a valuer, and you talk about the phone. You go, I can see what you're saying. You really don't need to get inside, and you give advice to the council. Is that right? And then you normally take your advice, and it's done and dusted. So, council won't like me saying this, but don't be scared to challenge evaluation. But it could come back more, but I don't think it can. But
it's really interesting. Everyone thinks, and it's always been the case, people object to the valuations because they're too high.
Yeah, it's exactly right.
You would be in the knowing what you know about land development, Rocky. There's a new tax coming in Victoria called the windfall gains tax.
Yes.
And the state government is going to take 50% of the value uplift when a property's rezoned now. And they're going to base that, the thinking is on the council rates, the year to year, so that as the council council rating valuations are updated, the property's rezoned, and they'll be. So we're actually getting objections from a lot of people who own future development land now. Our LG side of our business, they're receiving these valuation objections saying your valuation's not high enough because they're happy to pay. They want that first benchmark quite high, so when it's rezoned, they're only paying 50% of that, not 50% of the.
Look, that's interesting because. I didn't know how that was determined, if they did their own valuer or they actually get it by. Has that been determined now by the windfall tax?
It's going to be based on the land.
So just
valuations.
So elaborate that, because there's a lot of landowners that don't know or don't get their head around it. So how's the windfall tax going to work, David? Like with land development or?
So it applies. It's called a windfall gains tax. So that, as the name implies, the state government think we're doing all the heavy lifting on the planning work, the strategic planning, all the infrastructure, the roads and the schools and stuff. And all of a sudden one day you've got this paddock and it's zoned farming, then it gets rezoned general residential. It turns it from, $50,000 a hectare country into $500,000 a hectare country. We want a bit of that. It's not. They think it's not fair that someone just has such a big win like that. So they're now going to take 50% of that value uplift, and it's going to be reflected in the benchmarks between the council valuations. So if you've got a property now and it's already zoned residential, whether it's then you're not going to be, you'll have escaped it basically. But if you've got farmland or land that's in a development corridor or a precinct structure plan area, future residential land, at some point of time you're going to be caught by this windfall gains tax once the property's rezoned. So it's really worth getting some good advice from your solicitor, from your agent, maybe getting valuers involved to sort of make sure that you're stepping your way through this carefully, because the other thing that happens with the windfall gains tax is you can't defer it forever. You've got to pay it.
You've got to pay it one way.
That's exactly right.
There's a lot of farmers going to be caught out too.
That's the thing.
And you probably do need to sort of study it a bit further, because it's just the layman person out there who doesn't worry them because it doesn't affect them, but it will affect them because eventually that's going to be passed on to the buyer. Whether it's land's worth $300,000 a block now, it's going to be probably worth $350,000 or something like that. Because the developer's not going to either A, develop, or B, not going to take the cost, are they? They're going to pass it on. So it's going to affect everyone.
It is.
It's interesting that with the council rate. So so when does that come into effect? We've got a certain date.
It just started 1st of July this year. So they'd been talking about it in 12 months. It came out in the budget 12 or 18 months ago. You might remember. Been a fair bit of uncertainty about how it's going to be implemented, and that's still being worked through, to be honest. It's not exactly that they're making it up as they go, but the full detail is only just really starting to emerge. But it's from now, 1st of July this year, properties that are rezoned and rezoned to industrial, rezoned to commercial. Where there's a value uplift as a result of a rezoning, the state government's going to be looking for half the value uplift.
It's amazing. It's a lot of money. It's interesting when you said before about deferring it. How long can you defer? Because they want you, and there's interest on payment on that. Is that right? Yeah. So if a farmer's sitting there doing a dairy farm, it's changed from rural to residential. Hypothetically, that's they've gone from 5 million to 10 million overnight. That's 2.5 million they've got to come up with.
That's right.
Do they have to come up with it, or
when the property's sold, they have to pay it? And they can also pay it straight away upon the uplift if they want to. But usually people don't have that cash flying around. They've been running their dairy farm, running their orchard, for argument's sake, and all of a sudden it's worth a lot more. That doesn't mean the money's in their pocket. So until they sell it, they might not have that. So the original owner at the time of the rezoning can defer it for a period of time, but there's interest accruing on that as well.
Yes, that's what I was going to say, the interest. So and then who pays that too? Is it the owner or the buyer?
It's normally the owner, normally the vendor.
So if they're going to farm their farm for the next 20 years and there's that property rezoned, there's no mechanism to say keep it.
No.
They're going to pay interest at the end of that.
It's a big incentive. It's an incentive to activate this land as well, which is probably one of the things the government's trying to do, is get land into the pipeline and not have people sitting on land that's zoned but not moving towards development for long periods of time. Interesting
battle that, because council haven't been really proactive in trying to zone land, really, compared to it's been a battle. So you've got a state government that's wanting this land out, and you've got a local government that's sort of battling against it. Yeah. Look, I think that's legitimate criticism to some extent, but the other thing is, and we're both involved in land development in different ways as well,
what's happened in the last 3 years in regional areas, like I've been doing this for nearly 35 years in country areas, there's never been a market like this.
Correct,
and
totally
developers were completely caught out. All of a sudden they were selling stages out in advance, and the next stage sold in advance, and all of a sudden they're running out of inventory. They haven't got any blocks to sell, and all of a sudden the council thought, well, we thought we had 5 or 6 years supply zone. Guess what? We've got about 18 months left.
Yes.
Everyone got caught by this, as Crouchy said before, this remarkable spike in regional land values and regional land activity. Everyone got caught out by that. So, no one's to blame, but I think there's a unique set of circumstances.
Yeah, and that's my point, I suppose.
We do need to put more effort into that pipeline of land coming on.
And my argument was probably more about minimum compared to maximum. I think there's a maximum supply when it should be a minimum supply. Like, for example, I think there's a 15-year supply zone as a max, but it should be a minimum supply chain as a minimum, not a maximum.
I think that'd be a pretty useful tweak.
Yeah, if you tweak that a bit, it'd be so much better. That probably would eliminate a lot of the windfall tax. And not blaming our council. Hypothetically, this is not just our council. I'm talking general regional councils across. Yeah.
You're absolutely
so to clarify that's probably, each obviously council's got certain different criteria, but a tweak like that would make it so much easier. Now, like you said, it's become an extraordinary set of circumstances in the last few years. It's probably highlighted that fact that, hang on a minute, this probably should be implemented and changed. Because now we've got councillors going to Melbourne or whatever their state minister is to push land through because they were all getting caught out. So
that's right.
So I suppose we'll finish off, and it's I'll get you both to sort of comment. Chris, your specialty in residential. Can you give me a bit of an update on what the state of the market is currently in the Shepparton or wider region, Golden Valley, Murray region?
Yeah, so my observations in Shepparton especially, it's stayed pretty steady. So obviously we've had a hell of a lot of interest rate rises, which has slowed everything down, which is obviously what it's designed to do. But we haven't really seen any drops in values on our existing residential market. Probably, that's probably across the board really around our areas. However, like we're talking about the vacant land there, that's probably shown a bit of a reduction in values.
It's slowed down,
Yeah, it's slowed down, probably in relation to the higher building costs. So, you probably market for newer homes is probably slightly above where the value's at or where the existing market's at. So that's probably helping the existing market.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
As far as resi goes. So, yeah, that's probably where we're at.
Yeah, it's interesting. Shepparton traditionally has held its own, regardless of the histories we've been through. You might get the odd case, but usually they hold their own value. Yeah. Yeah, I find that the lack of land sales and the building costs, the interest rate rises, the cost of everything's going on at the moment. I think that's really helping that market. Yeah. We're finding that your 450 to 650 bracket's ticking along pretty well, as long as it's priced correctly. And if it's above the 700 plus, it sort of needs something, a bit of specialty with it. Yep. You over $1 million property, as long as they're price right, they're not really impacted that much. Yeah. It's interesting though, like 450 or less, that used to be the sweet spot, or traditionally the first home buyer investor market. But because of actual interest rates, that's actually making it harder, because the first home buyers sort of jumped out, and the investor, until the rentals catch up, they're not interested in investing in a property with the interest rates so high. Yeah. So we're finding that even though it's ticking along okay, it's not really what it should have been where it was probably pre-pandemic, during pandemic time.
Yeah, although it's interesting when you look how this area is performing compared to most other regions in the state that have shown clear reductions in their median house prices, right? Yeah, so Ballarats, Bendigos, Wodongas, all over the place, they're 10% down from the peak of their median price. Now, Shepparton has been holding its own and showing a slight increase.
Correct, yeah.
So that's unusual. And what we think, we talk about this in the office a fair bit, is it's because of the floods. Marutna got really badly hit, parts of Shepparton and some parts of Kyalla got hit. Rochester got wiped out, parts of Echuca did. All of a sudden, you take that housing out of the market. There are still people that can't move back into their houses, still fighting with their insurance companies, still trying to get planning approval to rebuild, all this stuff going on. It's actually, rents have increased in Shepparton much more than most other regional areas over the last 12 months. Yep. Everyone's trying to rent, and there are more people and houses here. Yes. And that's really underpinning our market a bit unusually. The rest of the state has passed its peak, we say, and just eased back a fraction. We're hanging in there and, in fact, showing a bit of growth for established houses, which is not how the rest of the state's performing at the moment.
Interesting, when the floods were on, we had a few homes around that, 300 to 400 bracket, all just sitting there. And as soon as the flood, look, we thought, hang on, something's like, if the interest rates are a bit, as soon as the floods come in, they all just got mopped up. Because the warehouse to live, people buying it for their friends, to move the friends in, or investors were buying in to move, So all of a sudden that was a vacuum that picked that up again. That definitely did happen. But it's sort of ticking along okay now, but not what you'd expect to be. And that's obviously the pressures of what has happened with the interest rate rises and cost of living, and the rents will have to catch up. And even though, look, I'm flabbergasted by some of the rent that we are getting at the moment. I sort of jumped that quickly for me too. I'm going, usually I'm pretty good at keeping a tab on the market, but and people are prepared to pay it.
Well, I have to. They've
got no choice.
They need shelter, unfortunately. And demand is outweighing supply.
Correct.
Still.
And it's always been that way, regardless. Shep's always been a strong rental market.
Yes.
It's actually even stronger now. Yeah. David, your expertise in the industrial commercial world, how's that state of the market in this would be interesting?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, we've been around the traps for a fair while. Industrial markets in regional areas have traditionally been pretty slow.
Yes.
They've been pretty thinly traded. Block sales have only been a couple a year, and you're getting a couple of % a year growth if you're lucky, and long periods of time in values and rents where it stayed the same. It was pretty flat. And over the last 5 years, and especially over the last 2 or 3 years, the growth in the industrial market around this area and a lot of other regional areas has been remarkable. Really strong land take-up, strong increases in industrial land prices, genuine rental growth, and what we call yield compression as well. So an investor buying an industrial property in a regional area for 20 years wanted a 10% return. I was
going to say that.
10% return we want. Yeah. And you know what? We're down in the 5s and 6s now. So they've halved that yield compression. That they think it's a good investment, and the industrial market is staying very strong. Good quality assets are still very highly sought after. Commercial's pretty mixed. Commercial includes retail and office, basically. Yeah. Retail is a bit all over the place still. Internet retailing is having a big impact on that sort of stuff. And you'll see going around Shepparton, there's a lot less shops selling things now and a lot more shops offering services. Because that's the people stuff you can't sort of get on the internet. So they're actually, the retail mix is changing, but retail rents are pretty soft. There's a lot going on in retail. People still aren't sure where it was going for a lot of product categories. That's in a state of flux. Having said that, if you've got an A-grade property with a really good tenant and a long lease on it, it's going to make a very good price because the investors are still chasing quality assets.
Yes.
I think it's starting to shake out a bit. Most things made a record price over the last few years. Now the market's discerning for quality. The better stuff is actually going pretty well. The B-grade stuff and the B- stuff has dropped off a fair bit.
Yeah.
And in terms of office space, it's interesting. There's been some really big new office developments here and some really large sales. Like we've got, sales of buildings in the town now, $17-18 million. Yes. Low yields,
which is unheard of previously. Yeah.
Yields in the 5%, where again they were always 8.5%, sort of 9%.
Yeah. So who are they by? Just to digress a bit, who are buying those properties? The big ones, are super funds? Or?
Yes, most of those sort of bigger ones are out of the reach of the mum and dad investors. Yeah. Absolutely. So big buildings with government tenants, long leases, that sort of stuff. $5 to $15 million sort of price bracket.
Yeah.
They're property funds and investment funds, and I suppose investment groups where people can buy shares or get exposure to the property assets through buying into the fund rather than buying into the property directly. Yeah.
It's a great sign for Shepparton, isn't it? Right back when the GSRE was in, Shep got hit pretty bad, right? You wouldn't have thought back in the industrial stuff too that you're talking about, but that's really a good sign for Shepparton. I mean, we're growing, the population's growing, that sort of stuff was probably unheard of,
Mate, the thing that sets us apart and we're talking, we cover a big footprint, talking to one of our guys who works in the northeast or the Alpine Valleys and Brighton, that sort of stuff yesterday.
Yeah.
Lovely part of the world, but so heavily reliant on tourism and hospitality, and it comes and goes a fair bit. This area makes things, and you look at the growth in our industrial estate, the land take-up, the massive sheds, they're big employment hubs, all those sorts of things. People in the recent past can look at Shep and say, the mall's a bit dead, there's some empty shops. That's not how Shep works. You have a look at the industrial base and the manufacturing base. It's a powerhouse.
It's unbelievable.
That's what makes the town hum. Not so much the shops in the main street, which is an important thing to have.
Yes.
That's not where the action is.
Correct. So what do you put down to the growth in the industrial? Because it's important, because I've done a lot in the last 3 or 4 years and huge dollars, a bit like the housing market. I couldn't you couldn't catch up the price values. Now, my advice now, because we've run out of land, right? So we've got no more industrial land. So I'm getting a lot of clients ringing me saying, I've got this bloke who wants to sell it, and I know most both buyer and seller, and they're doing a private deal. And I'm advising the buyer, listen, you've got no choice. You've got to pay this because there's nothing else coming, and we've got nothing to buy. Yeah. So what do you put down to... I've got my opinions.
I think, look, the area, the strength of the area is still on agriculture and on irrigated agriculture and adding value to that locally. So we've got the big SPCs and Campbell's Soups and the Numi, and the milk processing plants, all these sorts of things around the area. They're the big gorillas, but there's a whole ecosystem that supports those businesses. And they're specialist engineering businesses. There are all sorts of things out there. Agriculture in Australia has had a terrific run over the last 5 or 6 years. Brilliant. Exports are really strong. Commodity prices have mostly been pretty good. Yeah. Things are going pretty well. People are investing in that agricultural supply chain. That goes into logistics. People need warehouses and depots, and they're moving stuff all over the eastern seaboard in ways that they never have before. The biggest single user of the Port of Melbourne, for argument's sake, by sector is the dairy sector. Dairy exports are the single biggest user of the whole Port of Melbourne.
Amazing, isn't
it? And that coming out of here, adding value to it here, getting on the trucks down there.
That's unbelievable,
and all the things, servicing the trucks here, fixing the machinery, building the machinery, investing in the plant, the stainless steel stuff, the whole box and dice, and the professional services that support it, the engineering firms, the accounting firms, the law firms. That's what's driving it. So it's largely on the back of the ag boom, but we are really well placed to continue leveraging exposure to ag here.
Isn't that fantastic? Because what my biggest fear was, how long is this going to go for? But talking about land development and rezoning, there really is nothing coming along with future industrial land, really. No. I found it bizarre, which was a turn event, stuck there for such a long time. It's almost contradicted the trend of the smaller the block, the higher the square rate per metre. This is we're talking about industrial, where the bigger the block, they're still paying the full rate, because they couldn't get it and they were scared to miss it, And a lot of businesses were coming in and sort of selling off little factoriettes here and there because and putting it all under one roof line. So they're buying the bigger footprint, your 2 acre, 3 acre blocks, and they're putting it all under one roof and they're making it more efficient. So they've thought outside the square a bit, going, well, how can we save money by buying more land and putting it on the one roof line? So there's a bit of that happening.
Yes.
The land that I was selling, obviously Industrial Road, was interesting because that was big land purchases. It wasn't just your 2,000 square metre blocks. Yeah. It was your 2 acres, your 3 acres, which didn't help the supply because that took up a lot of that other smaller lots, which... Yes. But also, underpinned those areas, big employers too,
Yep, that's it. And I think there's some exciting things ahead of us on the industrial front, on the food processing front, on the ag supply chain front. I think what I've got a sense of is in the pipeline and people almost getting ready to commit to some significant new developments. Hold on to your hat here a little bit in terms of the industrial stuff in the Goulburn Valley and in Shepparton and Maroopna in particular.
Yes.
There's some big stuff that's going to start landing over the next 6 or 12 months.
Is that good?
Really significant?
That's huge. That's what we need to know. Well, that was really, really good. I really enjoyed that conversation, gentlemen. That was, I reckon that'll be very captivating amongst our audience. I reckon it was terrific. You've got two wonderful expert in their fields that will probably give you a bit more insight in the way Shepparton evolves and runs and valuations and so forth. But that was really interesting conversation, a bit of a snapshot about how Shepparton's going at the moment too, which is, I really enjoyed that. That was terrific, gentlemen.
Likewise.
Thank you very much for attending. And I hope we'll have you on soon.
Thanks for having us.
Good on you.
Yeah, Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers. That was great. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe on your favourite podcast platform so you don't miss upcoming episodes. We would love you to share this podcast with your network, and if you have any questions or feedback, please connect with us via our social network or head to gagliardiscott.com.au.